click start recording. And it looks like it's working. Cool. So we were talking about how computer science has made its way into other things, right? It's not just a bunch of programmers making circles bounce on a screen with the turtle library. It's people doing cool stuff like sending rovers to Mars. Yeah. So let's keep on going with that. I have one last main topic for us, and it'd be silly if I didn't tell you about it. Let's talk about cryptocurrency, because that is a nice, popular thing these days, right? A lot of computer science influence. It's just a bunch of programs deep down, right? Let's go into it. I will focus today on Bitcoin. Maybe you know more than me. Please shout out, correct me. If you want to talk about other things, we could get into those as well. I'm always welcoming comments. So let's talk about Bitcoin. Why not? So definitely the most popular cryptocurrency. Ethereum's getting up there. They're like neck and neck, but I feel like Bitcoin is still the most popular. Probably, definitely still the most expensive, right? So in terms of that, at least, I think it's winning. And I'm going to talk about it today at not like a programmer standpoint, very, very high level, as high as possible. We'll get into a little bit of the nitty gritty though. And yeah, so what even is all of this? What is a cryptocurrency if we have not been following this topic, or we're just not so sure about it? All a cryptocurrency is, it's money, right? So currency, but crypto. So there's some sense of electronics. There's some sense of cryptography, making sure that somebody is not stealing all your money, right? So it uses encryption, which we've talked about, to make sure that, well, first of all, nobody knows who has what. So there's a bunch of accounts, and they're all tied to numbers rather than people, right? So with enough cryptography, you can make it so that nobody knows whose account that is, okay? Which is nice. It was created back in 2009, so it's quite old, by a person with the name Satoshi Nakamoto, but we have, that's not a real name, it's a pseudonym. That person had some other name, and they did not want to attach their name to the paper that described Bitcoin, which is interesting to think about. Yeah, cryptocurrencies, they're super hard to track because it's hard to tell who has what until you cash out and convert to dollars or something. If you just stay in the Bitcoin place, nobody really can tell what you're doing. So that's not good for governments. And a lot of people have tried to copy Bitcoin, right? There's a bunch of different kinds of cryptocurrencies out there, a bunch of different alternative cryptocurrencies or altcoins. But I think Bitcoin is still the highest. So at a high level, instead of this is Lawton's account and he has $2 signs and this is my cat's account and he also has, I don't know, he has $1 sign. Instead of names, there are numbers. Right? So it's just a big long number. Those are your addresses of your accounts. Okay, so there's a concept of addresses that tells you who stores what. That's whose wallet you're talking about. That's the other fancy term, right? So there's the concept of a wallet, that's your account, and then every wallet is associated with an address. So they're like the same thing. Wallet is equivalent to an address, essentially. And the encryption makes it so that we don't know who's doing what. So there's, you can think of it as in terms of RSA, that thing we talked about once upon a time. There's a concept of a public key, a private key. We'll get into that. But the whole point of cryptocurrency is I can send my Bitcoin, and it's taken out of my account. I send it to my cat, and it's placed into my cat's account. All right? And it just makes sure that, okay, the sender, I give this address, and it all gets sent properly. It all works out, and whatever I had is now gone, and it's there in that other wallet. Okay, so that's Bitcoin at a high level. Are there any questions about anything? Any anyone wants to add if you're like crypto fanatics. We can totally talk about it all. All right, let's keep trucking. So Bitcoin exists in a place called the blockchain. That's the way that it keeps the Bitcoin network from like accidentally doing bad things, like accidentally doubling my money or accidentally stealing everyone's money. The blockchain is what prevents all that. So Bitcoin is just a bunch of computers working together. It's a network, right? It's a peer-to-peer network. It's kind of like file sharing in that sense. So I could be on my laptop doing cool stuff, and I could be connected to the Bitcoin network. If I want to make a transaction, I have to be, right? Or if I use some online service that does that for me, I have to get there eventually, right? And so there's just a bunch of, I don't know, boxes that are computers. They're all talking to each other. They're all connected to the Bitcoin network, all right? I'm just going to draw a few boxes. And I shouldn't draw arrows either. They're connected both ways. Everybody can talk to everybody else, send data in any direction, right? So there's just a bunch of these computers all talking to each other, all connected in some fashion. And yeah, the first idea is there is encryption involved. So a user's account number is their public key. Do you remember RSA? So there's a public key and a private key to decrypt things. You give your public key to everybody, that is essentially you. That's your name on the Bitcoin network. Just the fancy number that you came up with that has those fancy mathematical properties. Your public key is your account number. And so maybe that's stored, or I know my account number, and I can start feeding stuff into the network saying, okay, from my account, give somebody else this stuff, okay? And you cannot use your account without your private key. So that's how people can't impersonate you. You have to have them both together, and that is the way that it all works. So I don't know, here's my account, Lawton's account on the Bitcoin network. Maybe, remember, it's just a number, it's my public key. Maybe I have $2 worth of Bitcoins. In order to send money on the network to my cat or something, I have to use my private key to unlock my account. Okay, that's the idea. That's the fancy way that's all working. Any questions about that? So public key plus private key. Your public key is your identity. Your private key you don't want to tell anybody, because that's how you confirm to the network that I own this account. Just a lot of cool math doing that. So it's a peer-to-peer network. There's no one central place that's holding all of Bitcoin stuff. And then there's a public key to represent you and a private key to make sure that you were you. Okay? And then finally we get to the blockchain. So all the blockchain is it's just a giant file, and everybody has a copy of that file who's on the network. So I don't know. This is what it looks like. Big long file. And people also call it like a ledger or something. But it's just a record of every single transaction that's ever taken place on the Bitcoin network. Everybody has a copy of it. They're all there. Everybody has the copy of it, and they should all be in sync as well. Okay? So the very first transaction was like, give 1 Bitcoin to this address. The next transaction was give another Bitcoin to this address. From the beginning of time, since Bitcoin got created, all of these have been logged. All of these transactions were logged. And if you just play through that entire list, you'll know which account has what money. Right? That's how it works. You'll know exactly how much money each account has if you play through the entire transaction history. And nobody can make stuff up because they're all trying to share that same copy of that history. Right? So everyone on the network has a copy of that blockchain file, and whenever a transaction happens, it gets added to the end of that blockchain. So whenever somebody spends their Bitcoins, like me signing with my private key, I like to give this $sign to my cat, then everybody hears about it. They get a copy of that transaction. They all have to agree that, yes, the transaction takes place. It sounds legit. This person has enough money in their account to spend, etc., etc. And it gets added to the end of the blockchain. Okay? That's the idea there. And so that agreement is very, very helpful. Any questions about this so far? So all the blockchain is just a big long file saying exactly every transaction that's happened. Yeah. Everybody should have their own copy of it. It needs to be both locally and across every other computer, so it lives everywhere at once. That's the idea. Does that answer your question? Yeah. So it should be everywhere. Any other questions? These are good ideas, good thoughts. If you kept the blockchain in one central place, then whoever owned that server could start messing with it if they wanted to, right? You don't want that. So everybody gets a copy. Everybody has to agree on the new additions to the end of the blockchain. All right. For reasons similar to that, like you don't want to let one person have all the power, you can actually ruin Bitcoin if you had enough computational power. If you bought more than half of the servers that are on the Bitcoin network somehow, or if you just like bought 1 million computers or something and you all connected them, you would be able to take over Bitcoin. All right. So here's the idea. If you were a bad person, you would want to write the following to the end of the blockchain, like my account gets 1,000 Bitcoins, right? Everybody would want to do that. But the reason it doesn't work, the reason you can't do that, these days at least, is because the majority of the network gets to override you. They get to agree. Right? So here's all the computers connected to each other on the Bitcoin network. Let's say you're a bad person, you have control over this much of the network, not quite half. You can be like, all right, I'm going to let this weird transaction go through, and they all agree, but the entire network has to agree. They're going to cut you off from the network if you mess up like that. Okay, so greater than 50% of the computers on the Bitcoin network must agree. There's some very fancy computer science stuff, distributed systems, algorithms going on there to make sure they agree in order for a transaction to go through to be added to the end of that blockchain file. All right. So if you had enough computing power and enough like internet connections, you could take over the Bitcoin network. If you had this many computers, you'd be like, all right, we all agree to make some money out of thin air, give it to Lawton's account. If you had that control, you would force the entire network to agree with you. Isn't that cool? So if you had enough computing power, you could make Bitcoin useless. There's no concept of who has what anymore because you could just rewrite history. All right? And that's the reason a lot of those smaller alternative Bitcoins, altcoins, have failed and why they're not as popular. Because they are much more susceptible to this issue because there's not as many people on that network. Does that make sense? Any questions about that idea? All right, let's keep on trucking. Those are just fun stories. It's a fun, nice example of computer science in real life, I think. Let's next talk about mining. I'm sure you've heard of that. Finally, we're able to buy GPUs again because mining is no longer profitable. But it was for the longest time. And here's what it means to mine. All right, so everybody's connected to the Bitcoin network. They have to save this really long file, right, just to be on the network, which takes up a lot of space, takes up a lot of energy to like agree with all these transactions that are getting posted. There's a lot of computational effort going on just to be on the blockchain, or just to be on the Bitcoin network. Sorry. As an incentive for that, as an incentive to like get as many people as possible putting their computers on the network and copying that giant blockchain, the people who are on the network get rewarded. There's a little lottery that happens every few transactions, and that's how Bitcoins get made. All right. Incentive, people put their money on the Bitcoin network. There's a little lottery, which is funny to think about. Every couple transactions, new Bitcoins get made. The amount of new Bitcoins that get made is eventually going to become zero. Like at the very beginning of the network, like every few transactions, a lot of Bitcoins got made. And slowly but surely, that's going to taper off. That's just how Bitcoin works. And one day there will be 0 Bitcoins made from then on. There is no more incentive to be on the network. Okay, you get transaction fees, but that's about it at that point. No new Bitcoins are going to get made. So yeah, every few transactions, Bitcoins get generated out of thin air from nothing and sent to that lottery winner who is verifying the transaction. Okay. And so that's essentially how money gets printed in Bitcoin. Isn't that cool? And one day that supply, it's eventually going to run out. Nobody else gets any. There's going to be no more lotteries to win at that point to make new Bitcoins. And so, yeah, here is essentially how the lottery works. Everybody, they hear about the new transactions that are supposed to take place and that everybody's trying to put on the blockchain. To put them on the blockchain, you have to encrypt them in a cool way. And you have to compute a very fancy number based on the most recent transactions to verify that they exist and that they all work. So the fancy number is, or the lottery is, given the most recent transactions and compute some mathematical formula involving them, I would like you to invent a number that, when encrypted, has the following number of zeros. And it changes depending on how many people are on the network. So, like, I don't know, encrypt a number that ends up with like 10 zeros at the start of it. And that's like essentially random to compute. It's very computationally difficult to figure out how to encrypt a bunch of things to make a bunch of zeros appear at the front of the final answer. But that is the game. That's the lottery. So everybody is trying a bunch of encryption things very, very quickly to find a bunch of zeros, essentially, in a long number. That is the game. So they're all just solving a math problem. All the computers on the Bitcoin network, in order to make themselves more money, are trying to solve a fancy math problem to verify all these transactions. Okay, so that's mining in a nutshell. It's just, all right, every computer on the network, solve a math problem. Whoever solves it the fastest, it's essentially random who wins, gets a new Bitcoin. And that's how they make money, and that's the incentive to stay on the network. Any questions about that idea? It's a weird one. It's nice to have, though, because it makes that's the way Bitcoin got made, right? At the very first transaction, the blockchain was empty. You needed to mine some Bitcoin in order to be able to have some in your account and spend it. So that's the way it gets printed.
Is all mining software the same? Or are they running different programs?
The final answer needs to be a specific kind of encryption. It's like SHA-256 or whatever. You can look it up on Wikipedia. But yeah, they're all trying to do the same thing. But there's a secret addition, like you have to add to all of these transactions like the current time or something. You have to come up with a fancy number in addition to all of that makes this encryption go through. Yep. And it's just who can guess that number the fastest, or a number that works the fastest. Yep, but they're all doing the same thing. And so everybody else needs to verify that, yes, you got it right. And so it does have to be the same computation. Yeah, good question. Any other questions? Because, I mean, my question is this okay? This is an ethical kind of dilemma, right? Because, like, the first uses of Bitcoin, the whole reason a lot of people are using it is because of this anonymity, right? It's hard to tell who has what if you're spending stuff just on the network. So, the very first uses of Bitcoin, like the very first use of Bitcoin was to buy a pizza, which is kind of cute. But then after that, it was to buy drugs, to buy bad things, right, on black markets, places that the government can't track you. And yeah, the government can't track spending on the Bitcoin network. They can't track who owns what until they try to convert their Bitcoins to dollars or something. If you never convert, nobody knows whose account is whose. All right. Also, just in terms of like a store of value, Bitcoin is essentially the stock market. It's kind of akin to gambling. The exchange rate from Bitcoin to dollars has no real guarantees about anything. I have fun taking a screenshot of the current price of Bitcoin every semester I teach this class, and so here's how it's fluctuated over time.
Last year they had to report how much you gained or lost.
Yeah.
On your taxes.
Exactly. Yeah, that's a great point. The IRS is trying to take a bit of that money from you. But you could totally lie because they can't track you unless you try and cash out. So definitely don't lie. All right. But like here it was late 2020, it was like 11,000. Early 2021, it was like 60,000. Then I got 66,000. Late 2021, early 2022, spring this year, it was dipping down, and now it's definitely starting to collapse a little bit. So in a year's time, it's like a third of the value. So that's no fun. People trying to put their life savings into this, and like they're losing big time. That's not okay. Maybe that shouldn't be allowed. Something like that. All right. So the question is this okay? So we could ask our boys. We can be like, all right, Kant, what would you say about cryptocurrency? Kant would probably be for it, I would say, if you think about it long enough. Kant is definitely a proponent of individual rights, right? Should we always pay our taxes? Yes, that's a good thing. So he thinks that people are going to be probably good on average, and they'll pay the taxes, they'll do okay things, and so Kant would be for Bitcoin. Mill, probably you could argue either way, depending on who you think like wins out. You have to balance all the utility, right? So from a government's point of view, it's cryptocurrency is not the greatest thing, right? Because you can lie on your taxes pretty easily, get less tax money, and it allows more illicit activity, right? It's easy to spend things on the black market, spend your Bitcoins on the black market. Also, we didn't even talk about this, but the environmental cost is horrible. Luckily, Ethereum has finally transferred away from like mining, but Bitcoin still needs to be mined, which is a bunch of computers, with a bunch of GPUs, and a lot of power being consumed trying to do these fancy math problems to win Bitcoins. Right? So the last time I heard, it was like the Bitcoin network uses as much energy as Argentina uses in a year just to compute transactions and do mining stuff. So that's a huge environmental cost, right? We don't like that. So that could like tip it in the favor of no, probably we should get rid of this. But on the other hand, it's good for individual freedoms, right? I don't want to be tracked with how I'm spending my money, and that maybe wins at the end of the day. Therefore, it should be allowed. And here to stay. So that I'm not super confident about. I don't know too much about it, but the word, if you want to look it up, is Ethereum transitioned from proof of work, which is I have to do a bunch of computational things to verify these transactions and mine stuff. So that's proof of work. That was the bad thing. To proof of stake, and I'm not sure what that means too much. It's like, yeah, you don't have now. It's very computationally easy to say who has what. It's like I have this much stake, and I can verify it cryptographically somehow. But yeah, I'll have to read up about that because that's too recent, and I have not done enough work yet to learn about it. But proof of stake is the new thing. We can look it up on Wikipedia. Yeah. There is an issue with this. I think I've heard like if you own more Ethereum coins than other people, you have more say in the network, something like that. And so that could be a bad thing as well. Selecting validators in proportion to their quantity of holdings. So like you get more say in the network if you have more Bitcoins, more Ethereum coins. Okay? So feel free to look that up, but it has its own problems, but at least it doesn't consume a ton of power. That's what it's got going for it. All right. So, yeah, we know about Bitcoin, we know about mining. It's just a bunch of computers solving math problems all day long and spending a lot of power. I have a fun activity for us in relation to Bitcoin. Please play along. It's fun. I do this every semester. But instead of Bitcoin, I have invented our own cryptocurrency for this class with my cat as the mascot. We will call it Litcoin. It is worth pretty much nothing, but I'm going to have you pretend to be a computer right now connected to the Bitcoin or the Litcoin network. And if you solve a math problem the fastest, I will give you 1 Litcoin. All right? And I will actually draw a physical Litcoin for you on these napkins, and you can take it home with you. Okay? So the first person to come up to the board and write the answer, there's 3 questions. You can write it next to the question itself. It'll appear on the screen. Here's my answer. Something like that. The first person to do that for each question gets the marker. Are you ready? Here are your 3 questions. What is 0.42 times the speed of light in meters per second, etc., etc. The very first person to write the correct answer on the board next to that question gets a Litcoin. And so that's essentially how mining works in Bitcoin land. Good luck. Ooh, we have a contender. One, two. There also has to be consensus, so we've got to make sure that we agree with these answers too. That will verify them as well. All right, we got one more left. Who wants to do it? Or do we give up? Do we take ourselves off of the network? All right, I'm computing my own answers. Just now. But do we think these are all correct? Did we all verify them? All right, and then let me check today. So that is 5. Oh wait, no. Today's max temperature in Celsius is 13 plus 55 for San Francisco. Or no, 58 for San Francisco. All right, I think we're ready to verify these things. So, what is 0.42 times the speed of light in meters per second? I got something like 1,259,128.36. Nice. So that one checks off. Who got that one? That was you? All right, here's your absolutely. Yeah. All right, what's the atomic mass of carbon times the atomic mass of sulfur? 385 something. That looks good to me. Who did that one? Lovely. And then what's Fresno's max temperature today in Celsius plus San Francisco's max temperature today in Fahrenheit? It is not that. So that is not the right answer, but who wrote it anyway? So I think you stayed in Celsius both times or something. It's like 70 something. It's 50 something in San Francisco and like 13 in Celsius for Fresno. All right. So, yeah, that is essentially how Bitcoin works. Just people solving a bunch of math problems as fast as possible. The ones who win get brand new Bitcoins and have fun. Thank you for playing along. Enjoy your Bitcoins. Use them wisely. Are there any questions about anything before? Yeah, exactly. Before we start some new slides? All right.
I mean, ultimately, crypto's the future, right? We're leaning towards.
I think, yeah, I've heard that even the U.S. is trying to make their own now. That's trackable, though. They want to take the things they like from Bitcoin and then add the things that they didn't like, essentially. That's what I've heard, at least. Yeah. I mean, technically, we're all connected to a network these days. We all spend money with our cards more often than we spend money with cash, right? At least most of us. Yeah, those are great points. Any other comments before we switch gears? All right. The next topic of the day is a fun one. It's called game theory. If you've heard of that, you get to talk about games a little bit. It's a little mathematical, a little logical, so it's perfect for this class. I'll give you the scoop on the basics of game theory. There's definitely several classes that you could take on this, so I can't hope to teach you everything, but if you're interested in it, I encourage you to read up a little bit more about it. So, yeah, it's the word game is kind of like overloaded, but it's just a game is some interaction between things. You could think of it as a real game as well, but here's my silly starting example. So, this is Fresno. We love our corn. So, let's pretend there are two corn producers, and The question is, what price should they sell their goods at? Should they sell their corn at, right? So, I know, here are the corn producers. They have their little stands. Boop. So here's stand A, person A. Here's stand B, selling corn, person B. If one person sells their corn for a lot of money, like designer corn, and the other person sells their corn for pretty cheap, then everybody's going to buy corn from the cheap store, most likely, right? So that's how it's going to work. Game theory comes along and tells us what's going to happen for store A. If their price was so high, game theory is going to tell us that those prices will be driven down for that same product. They will, for the more expensive producer. So what was $50 is now going to be $5 eventually. In order to compete, they're going to have to lower their prices. If they're selling the same exact good, they have to compete. They have to lower their prices in order to compete, stay in the market, get business. This happens at gas stations. That's probably the most common place you'll see this kind of game being played. So there's eventually going to be an equilibrium, right? You drive around, you see corn, it's going to be at the same price. You drive around, you see gas, it's going to be at the same price, okay? Unless, of course, the two sellers collude and they all are like, all right, we're both going to sell our corn for $50 and we're not going to change our prices. That is against the law. But they could do that too. But either way, there will be an equilibrium, an illegal or a legal equilibrium, and game theory is going to tell us how that all works. That's what game theory is going to teach us. So game theory was invented by a very smart mathematician. His name was John Nash. He was the topic of a cool movie called A Beautiful Mind. If you haven't seen it, I recommend it. But let's learn a bit about it today. So yeah, game and game theory is a very generic term. It's not the same as like a board game or something. But a game is defined to be a strategic interaction between individuals in situations. So it's very vague. It can be applied to a lot of things, right? So it's a strategic interaction between individuals, right? They're trying to think about what the best move is in this game to play, and situations. Like, all right, the game is corn selling. The game is a board game. It doesn't matter, okay? This is the idea. So super vague, that means it can handle a bunch of different concepts, and that's why it's used in a lot of different fields. There are two main kinds of games. You can have a cooperative game or a non-cooperative game. So a cooperative game is kind of how you would imagine a normal cooperative board game to be. Like, people are better off working together, right? Forming alliances, forming groups. You're better off working together than you would have ever been alone, all right? So cooperative games are when people are better off working together than working alone. Gain more by working in a group. They could also be non-cooperative, where players cannot form alliances, or if they did, it would be not beneficial. Okay, so there are some games that are like that. So if people ever do end up working together, it's because they're kind of forced to, they're backed in a corner, they're threatened, we say. Okay, which is fun to think about. We'll get into that. But yeah, cooperative game theory is all about like putting into math the idea of fairness, because everybody needs to work together for some common goal and it's all going to work out. So that's what cooperative game theory is all about. Non-cooperative game theory is all about like putting into mathematics how someone can win. Okay, so cooperative is about fairness, non-cooperative is about winning. Okay, so I think you can imagine some games are cooperative, some games are non-cooperative. Okay, so yeah, game theory is used in a lot of different fields, so it's a great segue from our previous set of slides about computer science in a bunch of different places. It's used in economics, poli-sci, biology, philosophy, corn selling. It could be used anywhere because the definition of game is so vague. It applies to a lot of stuff. So yeah, people these days are trying to spend a lot of money to write programs to solve these problems that game theory presents. They're trying to solve for the optimal strategy to play their game, right? Whatever their game is under that definition, right? So the optimal strategy, how can they win, or how can they make sure they're in the group, if it's a cooperative game, that's going to be the best stuff. Okay? That's the idea. So, yeah, I think the example that I want to show us today has to do with a non-cooperative game. All right, this is where you cannot form alliances. It doesn't really work out in your favor. All right, you cannot assume that things are going to end up fair for you. So the very standard, the first most common quintessential example of game theory, especially non-cooperative game theory, is called the prisoner's dilemma. Maybe you've heard of it. I'm going to break it down in detail for us. All right, so here's the scenario. Here's the game. So two prisoners, two people, they've committed a crime, they're taken to prison. They are put into two separate interrogation rooms, right? So they're going to be asked questions about, did you do this, did you not do this? And they are given these options, okay? Ahead of time, before the questioning begins, they're like, all right, here's what's going to happen in each of these outcomes, all right? You can pretend you're prisoner A or prisoner B, it doesn't really matter, it's symmetric. So if prisoner A confesses, let's pretend we are prisoner A. So if you confess, you get to leave. You get to go for free. You get 0 years in prison. And if your partner does not confess, but you did, they're going to get 10 years. Okay? So that's scenario 1. Again, pretending we're prisoner A. You could also pretend we're prisoner B. Outcome 2 is, all right, if you don't confess, but your partner did, then you get 10 years. They get to walk free. They get 0 years in prison. All right? Outcome 3, if you both confess, you each get 5 years in prison. So that's better than the 10, right? But if you both confess, you're getting 5 years in prison. Outcome 4 is, well, if neither of you confesses, they don't have enough evidence to charge anybody. All the evidence is circumstantial. If neither of you confess, you both get to walk free. 0 years in prison for each of you. Okay? So the question is, what should they do? What is the optimal outcome? What do we think? What's the best outcome, the optimal outcome? What should be the equilibrium? Prisoner A, prisoner B. Yeah, that would be so nice. Exactly. Outcome 4 seems to be the outcome that's the best, right? But we're going to notice, and game theory is going to tell us, that outcome 4 is actually not the equilibrium. It's not going to be the one that they should do. It's not the way that they should be playing the game. All right? And it starts by making this grid of options. So prisoner A could either confess or not confess, C or NC. Prisoner B could also confess or not confess. All right? If they both confess, you're in this scenario, right? Confess, confess. Then they each get 5 years. A gets 5 years, B gets 5 years. If A does not confess, but B does, then A gets 10 years, B gets 0 years, and it's flipped for this one. If B does not confess, but A does, then A gets to walk free, and B gets 10 years. And then finally, if neither of them confess, they both get 0 years. All right, so what should they do? What is the optimal outcome? We would think that it's this one. And that's logical to us as humans, but the beauty of game theory is it tells us that this is actually not the best optimal solution to this game. And I will show you why. All right, so it's not trivial. Not trivial to see that, and I'm going to show you why. So what this man came up with, John Nash, when he invented game theory, was the idea of a Nash equilibrium. All right, it's going to tell us the optimal solution to this problem. All right, the real optimal solution, the way that they should be playing this confessing game. All right. So what is a Nash equilibrium? First of all, it's just, all right, this is very vague, very mathematical. A set of strategies, one for each player of a game, that has the property that each player's choice is their best response to the choices of the other players. That's the key at the end there. The best response to the choices of the other players. All right. Remember, this is a non-cooperative game. Prisoner A, prisoner B, they cannot talk to each other. They cannot come up with a plan together right now. They're in separate cells. They never get to talk to each other until after their questioning. All right. So here's the key idea. This is non-cooperative. Prisoner A has no clue what prisoner B is going to do. Right? They're scared, probably. They have to play it safe. That's essentially what Nash equilibrium is going to tell us. That's the mathematics behind it. Nash equilibrium is the mathematical way of playing it safe. All right? That's going to be the way to play this game. It's going to tell us how should the prisoners react. All right? So a Nash equilibrium put into more like normal terms, like instead of this, like best response to the choices of the other players. Alternatively, you could be like, the Nash equilibrium is kind of like a law that nobody wants to break. It's the best thing to do, right? A law that nobody wants to break, even if there was no punishment for breaking it. So, for example, a Nash equilibrium is driving your car and always obeying stoplights, right? Everybody wants to do that, even though you could totally run a red light if you wanted to. Most of the time, a cop's not going to be there. But everybody does obey stoplights, right? Because the alternative is usually you getting in a car crash, right? It's always the best thing for you to do, even if you're not going to get punished by the law or something, right? So it's a self-enforcing law, right? People still obey stoplights for that reason. Their best response to the choices of the other drivers, essentially. So for these prisoners, the way to determine the Nash equilibrium is to actually compute the average, right? There's going to be, what is the average sentence for each prisoner in each outcome? It'll be symmetric, so we'll solve it for one of them, but not the other. And then we'll see the answer. So yeah, again, Nash equilibrium, it is the way to play the game that's the best response to the choices of the other players. Same with stoplights. You see a stoplight that's red, you're going to stop there because you don't want to get hit or something, all right? It's the best outcome for you. So let's find that solution. Can I copy that square that I made? I think so. I'll try my best to copy this. Yep, we're trying. Try again. There you go. All right, let's put this in the middle. So the way we're going to discover the right thing to do, the Nash equilibrium here, is we're going to compute the average sentence in each outcome from the perspective of one of the prisoners. It's the same for each of them. It's symmetric, so let's just pretend that we're prisoner A. Right? So if we're prisoner A, here are our outcomes. Essentially, we have no clue what prisoner B is going to do. They could either confess or not confess, right? All we have control over is whether we confess or whether we don't confess, right? So we're doing this from the perspective of prisoner A, but it's symmetric. You could also do it from the perspective of prisoner B. So if we confess, we know we're in either of these cases, right? Does that make sense? If we confess, we're prisoner A, that all we have control over is our actions. We're in one of these two cases. Right? So either we're getting 5 years or 0 years. If we do not confess, we are in one of these two cases, right? Where we're getting 10 years or 0 years, right? And so the idea is we want to compute the average over what we have control over, right? What is the average sentence in each outcome, right? So if we confess, what's our average sentence? If we don't confess, what's our average sentence? So prisoner A, if they confess. Prisoner B, if they do not confess. What is their average sentence, right? So average time in jail. All right, so if they confess, prisoner A confesses, we're in one of these two cases, our sentence is the average, on average, we're either getting 5 years or 0 years, so that's, the average of that is 2.5. 5 plus 0 over 2, that's 2.5 years in jail on average, if we confess. If we don't confess, look what happens. We're either getting 10 years or 0 years. We're not sure what the outcome is because we have no control over what prisoner B does. But on average, if we don't confess, we're getting 5 years. Ooh. So this is actually the best outcome for us. Do you see that? Because we have no control, it's a non-cooperative game, we have no control over what prisoner B is going to do. Our best thing to do, our best outcome, is when we confess, on average. So it's best for us to confess. Right? It's always best for the prisoners to both confess. So in the average case, it always makes the most sense, you get the most gain, if you confess. So this seems really paradoxical, but the best option for both prisoners is to confess, which means this is not the equilibrium, this is not the outcome that's most likely, it's actually this one. That's the one that's going to be most likely. They both confess. A gets 5 years, B gets 5 years. Because of this analysis. Does that make enough sense to us? It seems a bit vague, but seeing this number being much smaller than this number and understanding that we have no control over the other person kind of should help concretize it in our mind. So yeah, that's your first taste of game theory. It makes the most sense, even though they're both going to get 5 years instead of 0 years, because you don't have control over the other person. It's non-cooperative. It makes the most sense. The equilibrium is going to be for each prisoner to confess. Any questions about that? That's kind of fun. So yeah, we'll talk more about that next time. The final thing that I want to talk about today is your next essay. So in addition to it being your next essay, it's going to be your final essay in this class. It's going to be due week 17, which is the last week of classes, right? So that's November 29th for most of us. That's that Tuesday. So you've got plenty of time. I just want to give it to you now. And I want you to go all out. So here is your prompt. This essay is whatever you want it to be. So have fun with it. Go crazy. I would like you to build your own essay. Write about anything that interests you. So write an essay about some topic related to computing technology or the internet, so something relevant to this class at least, that interests you and has social or ethical implications. There's plenty of things I can think of, right? I can help you if you're having any trouble. But write an essay about anything with this in mind, all right? The one thing it can't be is similar to the previous essays. I don't want to see a previous essay just built on really enough work. Okay, so make a brand new topic to talk about. Come up with that and make an essay around it. Okay, so yeah, I want you to do what you've been learning how to do, right? You have this issue that you're talking about. Pick apart both sides. Talk about any assumptions that are going on. Tell me about any fallacies that you see from each of those sides that are trying to argue in their favor. Tell me what Kant and Mill might think. Whatever might help you analyze this topic. Analyze the social and ethical implications of this topic. Okay, so it's going to be 1,000 words. Please write a 1,000-word essay, and it shouldn't be too bad to hit those words because this is a topic you care about, right? Whatever you pick. So that's why we're saving that for last. And I would like you to do some research. So please cite at least 4 separate works in this essay. Okay, so that's the idea. It's pretty. What's the word? I don't know. It's up in the air. It's completely up to you. Whatever you'd like to do, as long as you follow the guidelines. A lot of them. So yeah, go crazy. Write a fun essay about any topic and cite 4 works, and that will be your final essay in this class. Not including the one that'll be on the final exam. Yeah, 1 more essay to do. You're almost to the end. Any questions about this assignment? I'm excited to read whatever topics you come up with and talk about. All right. So if we're good, that is, I think, everything that I wanted to say. You'll have a new programming assignment as well, but that'll be next time in the programming lecture on Wednesday. So that's everything that I want to record.